Lobsterfest by Angelita Bradney. "Get down on your fucking knees," said Chef, "and get out anything that's half edible. We don't want to be short for Lobsterfest." I knelt beside the sack lying open on the kitchen floor. A fruity, rotting smell rose from inside. Some of what was in there was recognisable as carrots. The rest was little more than mush in a palette of black, white and green. Looking at the squidgy mass made my stomach heave. "Can I use rubber gloves?" "Nope." Chef turned away. I made a V sign at his back. Little over a month ago, a summer job on Jersey in the Channel Islands had seemed appealing. Live-in kitchen staff, waitress at a beachside hotel. Good weather, accommodation provided, no experience necessary. At the start of the holidays, I'd set off with my backpack and a heightened sense of my 18-year-old independence. The 5-hour ferry journey from Weymouth was long enough for me to feel on a real adventure. Each swell of the sea taking me further from home, and the flat I shared with my mother and her new boyfriend. "You don't mind having the box room, do you?" they'd said when we moved in. "After all, it won't be long until you want your own place." Arriving on the island, I'd taken a bus from the ferry port to the hotel that would be my refuge for the next 3 months. The address was La Route de la Baie, which sounded French and exotic. I got down from the bus, and as it drove away, I looked around and gasped. I was at the edge of a vast sweeping curve of sand, gleaming and flat as new plaster. The sea glittered in the distance. And just across the road was the hotel. There was an outside area with brown and white striped awning and palms growing in pots. A blackboard read coffees, teas, cappuccinos, espressos, ice-cold drinks, fully air-conditioned. Hung over the patio chairs were blankets to protect the guests from the sea breeze as they enjoyed the view. 4 long weeks later, looking down at the rotting carrots, I was under no illusions. My job could be part of a horror behind-the-scenes hotel documentary, or even featured in a piece on modern-day slavery. On the other side of the kitchen, Chef slammed plastic containers of pre-prepared food down on the counter, ready for the microwave. He insisted on being called Chef, as if we were in a top restaurant, instead of a place where the uneaten chips on people's plates were tipped back into the fryer to be reused. Just as he disappeared into the pantry, Katrina, one of the waitresses, came through to the kitchen with a broad smile on her face. £5 tip, she trilled. I shook my head in warning, but it was too late. That £5 belongs in here. Chef shot back into the kitchen, shoving it in at her chest. It probably wasn't an accident that he brushed her boob with the back of his hand. Katrina silently dropped the note into the container. In theory, the contents would be shared out every night between Chef and the rest of the staff. In the whole time I had worked here, I had never seen any money from the tin. Breathing through my mouth, I moved closer to the sack of what used to be carrots and rolled up my sleeves. Late afternoon, the lull between tea and dinner. The long rays of the sun reached across the bay, entered the hotel and splintered in golden shards on a large tank of water that stood in the hallway. I gazed through the glass at more than a dozen live lobsters. They had arrived earlier that day. Their bodies were a rich brown, burnished with orange, their eyes like tiny black berries. Around their mouths, small appendages like whiskers worked furiously. They seemed oblivious to the rubber bands around their claws. In the office, I knew that new menus were being printed. Lobsterfest, they read. From tomorrow there would be a promotional fortnight for the local delicacy. Chef had created 4 new lobster recipes especially. The smell of sweat warned me that he was approaching. He stood beside me, rubbing his hands together in front of the glass. He was unusually cheerful. "Look at those babies," he said. "A chance to do some real cooking at last." "You don't really boil them alive, do you?" I asked. He looked at me contemptuously. "Course. Why?" "Seems a bit cruel." I tailed off. "Add some slices of lemon and a bowl full of Jersey Royals. Lovely." He pressed a fat finger to the glass, leaving a grey smudge. "Wipe that off, will you?" I gritted my teeth and picked up my cleaning cloth. "This week and next," continued Chef, "I need you and the girls to be on your best behaviour, no cock-ups." I nodded. We'd already had the pep talk. One of the regular staff had told me that Lobsterfest was the most profitable time of the year. The dinner service was in full swing. Apron on, I ran back and forth from the kitchen to the dining room, hot dishes scalding my hands. My feet hurt, and my hair stuck to my neck. Plates clashed. Chef shouted. The service bell rang never-endingly. In the dining room, table 9 were complaining about the wait. A group of men on table 12 were on their 6th bottle of wine and making lewd comments whenever I was in earshot. I bumped into the other waitresses as the kitchen door swung and swung again. Dirty glasses piled up at the bar. Chef shook the tips tin in my face. I dropped in the coins I had just picked up. At some point I realised it was late. Tables were starting to empty. I gathered up the stained cloths. I could now hear the background music in the dining room, pop songs reinterpreted with panpipes. The bartender counted up the takings. The last table was vacated, its inhabitants staggering out into the night. Now it was time for the damp cloth, the bleach spray, emptying the slop bucket. I swept the floor, then mopped until I could hardly straighten. Soon I was the last one on duty. Chef and the other staff had left long ago. I turned out the lights in the dining room. Exhaustion hung off me like a blanket. In the hallway, the receptionist was watching a Polish TV channel, the sound turned low. I paused by the tank where the lobsters were perambulating slowly, oblivious to their fate. When did they sleep? I mounted the back stairs and collapsed into bed. The next day was the first day of Lobsterfest. I sent my clawed friends a silent hello as I passed their tank in the morning. No one ordered one for breakfast. I waited on tables for 3 hours, counting down the minutes until my mid-morning break. For once, nobody stopped me as I hung up my apron and sprinted out of the kitchen door, past the bins, across the road, and onto the beach. The sky was the colour of milk. I spread my arms as I ran across the sand, hoping that the breeze would slough away the greasy smell that clung to my clothes and hair. I headed to the furthest point of the beach from the hotel. It took me a good 10 minutes. Here was a jumble of rocks, which many years ago had tumbled down into the sea's frothy grasp. The lower boulders were studded with limpets and curled up sea anemones, small and shiny as spat-out sweets. There were good footholds, and I clambered over the pools of seawater where creatures hid and waited for the tide. Presently I came upon a boy perched above a particularly large rock pool. He had a bucket and an orange fishing net. As I approached, he looked up. "Shh!" he frowned. "You'll scare the lobsters." "Sorry," I said. I didn't like to push past, and I was curious about what he'd said, so I lowered myself onto a rock opposite him. Slowly he took his net and moved it into the water, then twisted his wrist and brought it up with a splash. He peered into it. "Nothing," he said, and sighed. "What are you fishing for?" I asked. He looked up at me. His nose was covered with freckles. "Lobsters, of course." "Do you get lobsters here?" "Yes," he declared. "I've only caught baby ones so far, but one day I'll get a big one." I looked down into the water. Seaweed sprouted from the rock faces, together with a colony of limpets. Shadows moved in the depths, perhaps just fronds of weed waving in an invisible breeze. The boy lowered his net again. Then he jerked it out and sunk it into his bucket. "Got one!" he exclaimed. "Can I have a look?" I asked. He nodded. I clambered around the pool until I was next to him. He pointed down into his bucket. There was something in there, swimming round and round. It was barely half the length of my little finger, almost invisible due to its transparent shell. "It's a baby lobster," said the boy. "Are you sure it's not a shrimp sort of thing?" I asked. He nodded. "It'll be my pet," he said, "but only till we leave the beach. Now, if I caught a big one, I'd take it home with me and look after it." "Well, I hope you find one someday," I said. Over the rocks, a voice called. "Time to go," said the boy. He picked up his bucket. "I've got a lobster too," I said. "Several, in fact." I don't think he heard. He just disappeared over the rocks. It was time for me to go as well. I clambered back and strode toward the hotel. The gulls cried overhead. They seemed to be saying, "Go, go, go." Go where? "You're late," said Chef. I looked at my watch. "I'm not sure if I am," I said. I was actually a minute early. "Well, you fucking are," he said. "Now get those tables ready for lunch." I looked across the dining room. Used napkins from breakfast lay over the tables like crushed birds. Maybe I'd had too much fresh air, but I found myself snapping back. "Why are you always so nasty?" I said. "How about saying please for once?" He said quietly, "You'd better watch your fucking mouth." I wanted to reply but could only come out with stammer noises. "You think you're only over for a holiday? Lying around on the beach, a bit of work when it suits you. I know your type," he went on. The unfairness hit me in the chest. I found my voice again. "I work all hours of the day," I said. "I've hardly even been to the beach." My voice was turning into a whine. "You take our tips. Speak to us like we're dirt." Against my wishes, tears started to gather in my eyes. I wiped one away quickly. Chef took a step toward me. I looked around. Where were the other staff? There was no one to be seen. I could see the pores on his nose and flakes of skin in his bristling eyebrows. I took a step back. A voice came from the doorway. "Excuse me, when are you serving lunch?" An old couple was standing there. It was the woman who had spoken. She wore a cardigan and a sun hat that looked as if it had seen better days. I had never been so glad to see a customer. Chef was unable to recover his composure. "Lunch at 12, he barked. "Thank you," said the old man. "Are you all right, dear?" asked the woman. It took a few seconds before I realised she was talking to me. I shrugged, unable to reply in the affirmative. "You should treat your staff better, you know," she said to Chef. She turned to her husband and took his arm. "Come on." I could see Chef's jaw clenching and unclenching as they left. A vein stood out on his forehead like a worm. Then he walked out and left me amongst the empty tables. Lunchtime. The dining room was busier than usual. In the kitchen I laid down the dirty dishes I was carrying and prepared to go back through. "Hold it." It was Chef. "I've got a job for you," he said. He beckoned. I followed him out of the kitchen into the hallway. He stopped at the tank of lobsters. My heart sank. "Thought you'd like to learn how to cook properly," he said. The lobsters were doing a slow dance in the water. "Pick one," he said. I looked around. No sweet old couple to rescue me this time. "I don't know how." "Just stick your hand in." He made as if to grip my arm. Okay. I shrank away from his touch. Feeling like there was a gun to my head, I plunged my arm into the water. My fingers closed around one of the hapless beasts. I pulled it out and held it away from me, dripping. Its back curled resentfully. It was surprisingly heavy. Chef jerked his head and I followed him to the kitchen. my heart thumping. On the cooker, steam rose from a large pot of water which spat and growled. Chef took up a knife and cut the bands around the lobster's claws. "Now drop it in," he said. I felt sweat breaking out on my forehead and under my arms. "What, now?" He nodded. I stared at Chef pleadingly. His face was impassive, but in his black eyes I thought I saw a glint of satisfaction. The lobster wriggled. My breath was coming fast and shallow. Bubbles detonated in the pot. "Hurry up!" I dropped the lobster in. Boiling droplets splashed up like pinpricks on my skin. There was a hissing noise, a bit like a scream. I dared a glance inside. Through the bubbles, the lobster was whipping frantically. Chef clamped on the lid and stood holding it triumphant. I fled. I would have liked to hide in the toilets for the rest of my shift, but the kitchen was busy, and I couldn't let the other staff down. After 10 minutes, I crept back in. Chef was waiting. The dish was ready. He hadn't let anyone else take it. "Table 3, he said. I looked down at the plate. The lobster lay like a blistered hand on a layer of bright green lettuce surrounded by lemon slices. I didn't do anything then and there. I worked into the evening as normal. More lobsters were cooked. I did my duties, spoke little, kept my face stony. My alarm went off just before 5 a.m. I'd spent a wakeful night. My bag was packed. I'd lose the week's pay, but I didn't care. I crept down the back stairs in the darkness. The reception would be closed, the morning staff not due for another hour. It was a shame for Katrina and the others. No doubt Chef would take his anger out on them, but I'd ruin his lobster fest. The hallway was silent, save for the bubbling of the filter in the lobster's tank. A faint light from outside illuminated the surface of the water. I stopped by the tank and fumbled for the sack I had taken from the kitchen the previous night. Hopefully it would be strong enough. As I plunged my arm into the cold water, goosebumps rose on my skin. Quickly I picked up the lobsters, one by one, and transferred them gently into the sack. When I had finished, there was water all over my clothes and the floor. Someone else would clean that up. A clicking and popping sound was coming from the lobsters. "Don't worry," I murmured. "We'll soon be out of here." The fire exit from the kitchen opened with a clunk. I swung the sack of lobsters off the ground and passed through. The door slammed shut behind me. I ran down the beach, my ankles twisting on the dark sand. The sack was heavy and my bag bumped on my back. There was the tang of salt and seaweed in my mouth. Blood pounded in my ears and unseen shells cracked under my feet. Far out to sea, I could see the lights of fishing boats under the first glimmers of dawn. Panting, I reached the rocks where I had met the boy. I lowered my bags to the ground and pulled off my shoes and socks. I could clearly see the glints of water in the rock pools and the white surf where the tide was climbing the beach. I picked up the sack and pulled it into the sea, wading out as far as I could. I pushed the sides of the sack down until the lobsters were almost able to climb out. Then I coaxed each one over the edge, swiftly pulling the rubber bands off their claws. When I had finished, the water was well above my knees, and the lobsters had started moving out to sea. With my remaining bag, I jogged towards the road. There would soon be a bus to the ferry port. I wanted to shout with joy, and I did, crying like a seagull high into the cool air. I looked back towards the horizon, where the distant mass of France would soon be visible. I'd always wanted to go there. The sky was lightening to pale gold. It was going to be a clear day.